Dr. Robert Ross, who is the President and CEO of the California Endowment, is going to kick us off for this evening.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie is the director of our Center for Healthy Communities, and I want to welcome all of you. Some of you are repeat visitors to our center. Others, this may be the first visit. In either case, welcome or welcome back to our Center for Healthy Communities. Tonight we have another in a series of extraordinary conversations for you to witness and be part of. And let me tee it up this way. The first time in an earlier career, when I was running the public health department at the city of Philadelphia, we had the prison health system under our responsibility, and I would occasionally visit the inmates at the prison just to check on how the quality of the health care was going. And I remember one particular visit when I went to the women's jail. And I had an opportunity to have a conversation with maybe 20 or so women, mostly African-American women, about how things were going and in terms of health care and other issues. And we got into a conversation where the woman who was giving me the tour, that was with one of the staff of the facility, and the conversation went to the matter of sexual abuse. And as this conversation went on, I went on to ask these women, how many of you have been victimized at some point by sexual abuse? And most of the hands in the room went up. And that struck me as too powerful to be coincidental. And it was, as a practicing physician, I had not, and you'll hear from one of our guests this evening, I did not learn that factoid in medical school or in my formal medical training. I learned it by just asking a question in conversation. And so tonight, we're gonna lift up the hood underneath that issue, the broader issue of adversity in childhood and in early life, and how that plays out in your health across your lifespan. And you'll have, it's a fascinating panel of experts and an extraordinary moderator, the best, I think, in the country at issues like this. But we're going to take a little bit of a dive into the issue of adversity in childhood and wellness or lack thereof. And there's a lot of this as a silent, quiet epidemic, the issue of trauma and how it plays out across people's lives. And as you'll hear from one of our guests, Dr. Felitti, you'll hear him blow up the myth, the saying that we all heard as kids around the dinner table, time heals all wounds. Maybe not. Maybe not. With that, let me introduce the extraordinary individual. We were joking previously, I have his bio here to read, and now I'm afraid to read it.
Good.
Because Tavis likes to joke that the longer you have to read somebody's bio, the less important they must be. So I don't know what to do, man. I got this bio in front of me with all these things you did, but I'm afraid if I read it all, you may say, well, man, Bob must not think I'm very important. But Tavis Smiley is an extraordinary journalist and leader and activist. You know that he has his own late night television talk show on PBS. He's the co-host of Smiley and West. He and Cornel West have been on tour looking at poverty in America. Hopefully, Tavis, you'll give yourself 30 seconds to talk about that book coming out. In fact, is it okay to say that we're going to have a book signing? Mm-hmm. Is that all right? Am I blowing something?
Not tonight.
Too late.
But yeah.
Stay tuned. We'll have a book signing event here in the near future for Cornel West and Tavis Smiley on their book. And all you need to know is that Time magazine named him to their list of the world's most 100 influential people in 2009. And he looks far too young to be in his 20th year of broadcasting, but he is. And join me in welcoming the extraordinary Tavis Smiley.
You're always too kind. Good evening. Good evening. All right. That's better. Obviously, my advice to Dr. Ross didn't mean diddly, did it? Because he still read the bio anyway, which I appreciate. I was saying to him backstage, as I say often, that the more important you are, the shorter your introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, the Pope. See how that works? So I'm trying to get to the point where they just say, ladies and gentlemen, Tavis. But until such time, I'm delighted to be back at the California Endowment and always pleased to accept the invitation of Dr. Ross and company to be a part of the work that they are doing in whatever small way I can. And tonight that means moderating this conversation once we hear a couple of important but brief presentations from the two gentlemen who are joining us tonight. Let me thank those of you who are here. I know, because I live in this city as you do, that there's so much going on in LA, and I am always humbled, and I mean this sincerely. I'm always humbled and I am always appreciative when I see Angelenos show up en masse and pack out a room for a conversation about what really matters. Oftentimes, because we live in LA, we can get so titillated and so stimulated by the superficial. That's easy to do in a place called Hollywood. But much more difficult to get people to hone in on, to care and be concerned about things that really matter. Last year, I was humbled and honored to do a primetime special for PBS about the crisis, specifically of young black boys in America. Dr. Ross and others were very supportive of that. We called that special, for obvious reasons, vis-a-vis the crisis of young black boys in America, too important to fail. If the banks were too big to fail, then these boys are too important to fail. And so I've been connected to this work for many years now through my own foundation about trying to address the crisis, specifically where young black boys are concerned. And so you see, therefore, why I was so, again, honored and humbled tonight to be asked to be a part of this conversation. But I'm going to be brief because I want to get to these two guests tonight and, more importantly, get to your questions that we will take on blue cards, I guess, index cards, as was said earlier, later in this conversation. So thanks for having me. Glad that you were here. And let's have a conversation about this important issue tonight. We're going to have two presentations, I said a moment ago. First, Dr. Felitti, and then Assemblymember Swanson will come. And they're both going to give, again, two brief presentations, but I think it important that you hear from them, at least about the issue tonight, to set the framework for the conversation I then want to have with them about these issues, and then we'll bring in your questions, as I said, later in our dialogue. So let me introduce very quickly. They have long bios as well, and they really are important people, and I am going to read their bios because it's important for you to understand where this issue is concerned, the credential that each of these gentlemen have, and what they have been doing for quite some time now that makes them persons that we ought to be listening to tonight on this important matter. So Vincent Felitti Md is a noted physician and co-principal investigator of the internationally recognized Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, better known and more simply called the ACE study, a long-term, in-depth retrospective and prospective analysis of over 17,000 adults that matches and tracks their current health status against the categories, 10 categories, in fact, of adverse life experiences during their childhoods. Findings to date reveal a powerful dose-response relationship between our emotional experiences as children and our physical and mental health as adults. I could go on, but to go on would trump what he wants to say, so I will stop with that. He is a graduate of the Johns Hopkins Medical School and a physician in the Southern California Permanente Medical Group. In 1975, he founded the Department of Preventive Medicine for Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, a clinical professor today of medicine at the University of California, San Diego, and a fellow of the American College of Physicians, and on and on and on it goes. Please welcome Dr. Vincent Felitti.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm impressed to see the interest in the audience. Let me start by asking a question. If someone gave you this newborn infant on the left with all its extraordinary potential and said you had 20 years to convert it into the man lying unconscious on the sidewalk, overlooked because we really don't know what to do. How would you do that? How would you do that in 20 years? Destroy the potential of a human being? Obviously, we know at some level because we do it rather effectively. My intent is to show you some excerpts of conversations with patients talking about things that nice people don't ever talk about. And so nice people never know, thereby allowing monstrous things to occur. My intent overall is to change your thinking in certain realms where our performance is really miserable. This woman, whose name will appear on the screen at her request, because she doesn't want her message to be minimized by anonymity, has some important things to say. You'll notice that she is talking really about the conversion of life experience into biomedical disease, in this case, cancer.
Can you tell just by looking at me that I was an abused child? Can you tell that I was sexually abused routinely, that I was neglected, starved, beaten? Probably not. You would have to ask in order to find out, and that's not the sort of thing that people typically ask about. The downside of having this kind of childhood is that it translates into health problems in adulthood, at least in my situation it seems to have done. I'm now recovering from my third battle with cancer. Not the same cancer, 3 different kinds of cancer. I've had chronic pelvic pain, migraines, the whole laundry list of medical complaints, all of those sorts of things that are very difficult for physicians to figure out. Growing up that way instills a constant fear, a constant state of turmoil that's just under the surface of a veneer that's fairly thin. Little things become scary in an atmosphere like that, and once you've internalized all of that, it's very difficult to let go of it.
This is an interesting man. He's a very bright guy. The backstory is that he was heavily beaten as a child by his stepfather. At age 20, he was imprisoned in Rhode Island for attempted murder. Ultimately, he got out, became a good citizen. He's got some impressive things to say about the benefits of nicotine, alcohol, and street drugs, the benefits of them. The question to ask yourself is, given the risks, why were these benefits needed?
20-25 years drowning out some poor childhood experiences with drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. Got rid of the drugs, got rid of the alcohol. Next thing I got to get rid of is the cigarettes. And I had no idea that the nicotine played such an important part in keeping that door closed.
In keeping the door closed to?
The memories that I've blocked out with all these years with the alcohol and the drugs.
So you see what's happening to you now as related to what happened to you decades ago?
Yep. I found a way to block the emotions and the memories.
With?
Drugs, alcohol, cigarettes.
The functionality of what we misleadingly term dysfunctional behavior. This is an interesting man who also lost his father. His father abandoned the family when he was 2. He was sent so his mother could work to live with his grandparents. His grandfather was a pretty violent alcoholic, and this man, as a kid, discovered that eating helped him feel better. As in, sit down, have something to eat, you'll feel better. He lost 158 pounds.
That I ate because I was hungry. It was, when I look at it, it was just a place for me to feel safe. As a child, I remember there was a point, I would probably say, all the way from kindergarten to, God, I don't know what grade, but I used to get beat up all the time. All the time. And when I got the weight on, didn't happen.
In other words, he's talking about the protective benefits of obesity. Isn't it dangerous? Yeah, no question. That addresses only half of the equation. Ultimately, we were hearing so many of these stories that it became essential to figure out whether this was really going on at some significant level in a general population. And so we at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego and the CDC set up a study involving 17,500 people, matching current health status against 10 categories of adverse childhood experience. The average age person in our study was 57, 80% white, including Hispanic, 10% black, 10% Asian. Average age, I said, was 57. 74% had been to college. I suspect a group remarkably similar to you and me. And then we've been following them forward for the past 17 years now, matching what happened 50, 60, 65 years ago against current pharmacy costs, ER visits, doctor office visits, hospitalization, and death. Interestingly, we published a paper recently that if an individual had experienced 6 or more of these categories, and I'll define them in a moment, 6 or more, their life expectancy was shortened almost 20 years. You might think about what the mechanisms would be for that to happen. Here are the categories. Major emotional abuse, basically recurrent humiliation. In a sample of 17,500 middle-aged, middle-class people, 1 in 9 acknowledge that. You're familiar with it. You are the stupidest kid I've ever seen. Oh, God. You kids ought to be taken out and shot. Your father and I really were hoping for a boy, etc. Major physical abuse. I'm not talking about spanking. I'm talking about fists, sticks, wire coat hangers, the cord on electric irons, which is favored by many mothers. 28%. Contact sexual abuse, not somebody flashing a kid. Contact sexual abuse. 28% for women, 16% for men, 22% average for the group. A group remarkably like you and me. Major emotional neglect, 15%. Major physical neglect, 10%. Growing up in a home where one of the members of that household, could be an uncle living in the house, could be your mother, etc., was an alcoholic during your childhood or adolescence, 27%. Losing a biological parent in childhood or adolescence, any reason. Most commonly, obviously, divorce, 23%. Growing up in a home where someone in the household was chronically depressed, mentally ill, suicidal, or in the state hospital, 17%. Growing up in a home where a mother was treated violently, 13%. In a home where one of the members was imprisoned, 5%. Pretty hard to believe this initially. Question is, of course, how these play out during a lifetime. We created a so-called ACE score where the number of categories was summed, not experiences or events or incidents, but categories of events. And what we saw here is that for self-acknowledged alcoholism, the question we used was straightforward. Have you ever considered yourself to be an alcoholic? We saw that as the ACE score increased, as the number of categories of adverse childhood experience increased, the likelihood of being a self-acknowledged alcoholic increased rather dramatically. Now, you heard that man talk about keeping the door to the past closed. You all understand that. You know, sit down, have a drink, relax. Some of us need a great deal of relaxing. This is for self-acknowledged injection drug use. And what you see here is not fully displayed because at ACE score 6 or more categories, it is wildly off the scale. At 6 or more categories of adverse childhood experience, there is between a 3,100 and a 5,000% increased likelihood of injection drug use as compared to ACE score 0 to none of those categories. Now you think about the idea, you know, that there's something intrinsically addicting about drugs. You know, the conventional thinking, you take heroin enough times, you're not going to be able to stop. That doesn't fit in with what's displayed here, does it? Maybe there's something faulty with that idea. You all heard of crystal meth, you know, the demonized street drug. Virtually everybody knows it's bad stuff. Virtually no one knows that methamphetamine, crystal meth, was the first prescription antidepressant introduced for sale in the United States in 1940. And to illustrate that, this is a full-page ad from a 1942 issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association. Methamphetamine was essentially the #1 prescription antidepressant for the next 20 years. So the question is, does it mean anything that the most commonly sold street drug has potent antidepressant activity? Is that just, you know, an irrelevant coincidence? But isn't it dangerous? Yes. So too would be taking 50 aspirins. That would be a lethal dose. The question is not whether its unregulated use is dangerous. The question is, why is it used? Is it beneficial to that individual? Not everybody's interested in serving out a full life sentence. So life-threatening risks 10 years downstream often don't count much when the relief that you need is today. Here we're looking at the relationship of ACE score to suicide, to attempted suicide later in life. And again, I've left off ACE score 6 because it's so wildly off the scale. At ACE score 6, the likelihood of attempted suicide later in life is 46 times, 4,600% greater than at ACE score 0. But what about biomedical disease? If we look at liver disease of all types, we see the same stepwise proportionate increase between adverse childhood experiences and liver disease at some point later in life. It raises a very interesting and difficult question. How does life experience translate into liver disease? Well, if you drink enough to feel better, that's a start. If you shoot up to feel better, that's a start. If you behave in ways that are likely to get you chronic hepatitis, that's a start. Ultimately, the question comes, I mean, this is really overwhelming. We have over 60 publications out of the medical literature about various aspects of this. What do you do with the information? It's clear to me now, and to those of us involved in this study, that one important thing would be to routinely seek by questionnaire a history of adverse childhood experiences from everyone in a prison, in a chronic disease hospital, from all patients in a regular medical setting, in terms of little children from their parents, in terms of their family histories. And many people would say, but my God, what would I do if somebody said yes? And the sentence to remember is, tell me how that has affected you later in your life. So I see on the questionnaire that you were the one who discovered your father's body when he hanged himself. Tell me how that's affected you later in your life. So I see on the questionnaire that you were molested as a kid. How has that affected you later in your life? We realized the need to translate this into our general medical questionnaire, and so this is a sampling of a number of questions that we added related to traumatic life experiences. And the interesting thing was that the addition of these helped us enormously understand and treat many problems that previously had seemed totally incomprehensible and intractable. And an outside group did a large study for us with the new questionnaire and demonstrated that the use of the questionnaire coincided with a 35% reduction in doctor office visits in the next year and an 11% reduction in ER visits. Now, a lot of people are very concerned about the cost of medical care these days. 35% reduction in overall outpatient utilization translates into extraordinary sums of money. You get some sense of the general importance of all of this. If you are interested and want to pursue this further, Google the term ACE study. Here's some other sources of information, but that's essentially what we have learned, namely that 10 categories of common experiences in childhood, not recognized because, of course, polite people would never think of asking, have a powerfully destructive influence decades later and underlie some of the most important public health and social problems that we face in the country.
I was in church last Sunday, Dr. Ross, and we had a guest speaker, and there's a woman seated next to me who leaned over and said to me, because he just wouldn't stop, just kept going and going and going like an Energizer bunny, but he wasn't that good. She leaned over to me and asked me, when is he going to finish? And I said to her, he's finished, he just won't quit. I raised that to say that it is rare that you get such a thorough presentation in a matter of minutes. Please thank Dr. Felitti. Very thorough and very quick, and I appreciate that. It really just, I've had a chance to read the entire study in advance of our conversation tonight. It really is very thorough and very fascinating, and that's an understatement. So you might want to, beyond tonight, take him up on his offer to dig a little deeper. But we thank him for his presence, we thank him for his work, and look forward to some questions with him in just a moment. I certainly have some, I know you have some as well. Before we do that, Dr. Ross and I were talking prior to coming in here tonight about the propitious timing of this conversation here at Calendar, because there is in the state of California tomorrow a hearing that will be taking place, chaired by the Assembly member seated to my right, that will no doubt cover much of what Dr. Felitti and his team have been working on. That committee will be, the committee hearing will be chaired by a select committee. In fact, the Select Committee on the Status of Boys and Men of Color will be chaired by Assemblymember Sandra Swanson. He proudly represents the vibrant East Bay communities of Oakland, Alameda, and Piedmont, an area native with deep ties to the community. He was first elected to the Assembly here in California back in 2006, long-time activist. So he's a long-distance runner, having worked for 5 years as Congresswoman Barbara Lee's Chief of Staff, and prior to that, 25 years, helping to run Ron Dellum's organization. So where it comes to these issues, he's worked with two persons who we all know are very committed to these issues. And so I think we were blessed here in the state of California to have him then move on in his own right to be a member of the Assembly again, where he chairs a couple of important committees, including, as I said, the Select Committee on the Status of Boys and Men of Color, but also chairs the Assembly Labor and Employment Committee, and also the Select Committee on State School Financial Takeovers. So I think it's probably important to hear from Assemblymember Swanson now on the work that he's doing, what he hopes and expects will come out of these hearings that will commence here in California tomorrow. And then after his presentation in his own way, we'll start our question and answer session. So good to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm just, thank you. I'm just thrilled to be introduced by Tavis Smiley. I mean, that's just a thrill for me. And Dr. Fellini, I compliment you on your ACE study. It's helpful when we can evaluate not only the importance of environment, but how environment impacts all of our lives. And then we live with these problems. I grew up in Oakland. Obviously, I was a young man of color on the streets in the city of Oakland, exposed to many adverse situations. And I always say, you know, by the grace of God, there goes I. I'm totally honored to be a member of the California Assembly. I'm the only African American in the California Assembly in Northern California, out of our great state of 38 million people. Working with the endowment and Dr. Ross, let me just say thank you so much for your interest and endowment's interest in healthy communities. We ignore that problem. We walk by a number of problems, and healthy communities, we take for granted that concept. And we narrow our definition of what health is. We talk about health as whether we have a cold or not. But we don't talk about it in the context of stress. We talk about the need to be healthy in very traditional ways, but not preventing a gunshot wound. And how do you do that? All of us have to be concerned about these issues now, because not only should we be concerned because we're here together as people, but because it impacts all of us in terms of how we live our lives. So I went to, I spoke with the endowment and as well as the Speaker of the Assembly, Speaker Perez, about giving me the authority to organize a select committee on men and boys of color. Now, this is certainly not to exclude our concern about young women. Matter of fact, I will say parenthetically that over the last 5 years, I have led a campaign in the legislature where we're trying to rescue young women that have been subjects to human trafficking. This is a form of modern-day slavery. We walk by these problems in each of our communities where we see 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds who are subject to those that would imprison them in this form of human trafficking. And we have developed in the legislature a number of laws trying to rescue these young ladies that have that find themselves in this condition. But as we were doing that work, we also had to think about what we call the lost children, the invisible men that we walk by, that we ignore, that we don't pay attention to, not questioning how they got into the position that they're in, which the ACE study helps talk about those conditions. But we also have to examine what do we do to interrupt this destiny, this future of adverse impact. At what age do we intervene? There have been studies on the status of men and boys of color, but we want to take the studies off the shelf, and we want to implement solutions to the problem. If we know as a matter, and can show empirically that if a child is chronically truant, what will happen to that child and how the society would have to respond to that child, then what are we doing to interrupt that truancy? If we know that early detection of health problems in our children can help build a healthier life, then why do we run away from having nurses on school campuses or even clinics on school campuses? There are solutions to these problems. Now, we're forced to have to address these questions now, not just because it should be a moral concern to us, but it's now also a great economic concern to us. Why should all of you, all of us, pay $50,000 a year over and over again for the same individuals going in and out of the system without us understanding that that money could be spent differently, and without us appreciating the fact that education has interrupted that cycle? So why don't we have enough sense to make that kind of investment? So tomorrow, our hearing on Men and Boys of Color's travels to Los Angeles. We were in Sacramento. We were in Oakland. We're in Los Angeles tomorrow at Exposition Hall at 2:30. And what we're trying to examine are those questions. First, we want to demonstrate that we just care, that this is a problem that we need, as a community, we need to address. With all its complications, we can't continue to walk by this problem. We can't afford to continue to walk by this problem. And there are solutions because there are things that are working and there are best practices. And so I will say to all of you, thank you for your interest in coming out this evening to hear our conversation about this very important issue, and just thank you all for caring. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You can see I slid forward in my chair now because this is where the fun begins. We've got 45 minutes in this conversation, and there's no way we can do justice to this topic in 45 minutes, but I want to get a few questions out to get the conversation started, and I'm going to share, as I said a few times already tonight, I'm going to share these 45 minutes with you, and somebody somewhere has provided some index cards for you to write questions on, and I know they're out figuring that out as we get the conversation started. Dr. Felitti, let me start by, with all candor and seriousness, thanking you for the fine work that you are doing and have been doing for many years now. And I want to thank you because when you start to marinate on and wrestle with the data that you provided us, it becomes clear to me that childhood trauma may very well be the most basic of all public health challenges in this country today. It may be the fundamental, most basic challenge, childhood trauma, of all that we face today, in part because I think we all believe that each of us is the sum total of our life's experiences. We are all the sum total of our life's experiences. So having said that and having congratulated you for the fine work that you are doing, a very simple question: who cares? And I ask who cares because if you were on my television, if we were doing this conversation tonight on PBS, I suspect there'd be a lot of folk in the watching on national TV tonight who would be sympathetic and empathetic and understanding and curious about the work that you're doing. But I also know, because we live in a place called America, there'd be a lot of folk who'd say, so what? Get over it. Because we are the sum total of our life experiences, all of us have issues, and at some point you got to grow up, or as we say in the hood, you got to man up and deal with it and get over it. So I ask to start this conversation respectfully, but fundamentally, so what? Who cares?
Well, the people who are directly involved care. The people who are married to them care. Their children care. The rest of us, if we are not directly connected, are going to be indirectly connected in terms of community safety, in terms of the cost of running a huge prison system, in the terms of the cost of social welfare systems that have to be maintained, etc. In one way, or different people will care in different ways, some emotionally, some economically, but the costs are inescapably enormous And I think your opening sentence about the main engine underlying the health, the social function, and the economics of the country is a very well taken one.
Before we go a little further, since you have now raised, following Assemblymember Swanson, the notion of the economic price we're going to pay as a society, let me challenge that. If I say to you, Mr. Swanson, that in California and across the country we are privatizing prisons faster than Hannibal crossed the Alps, so that's not an expense that I'm going to be bearing in the long run. If the privatization of the prison industrial complex continues to grow, that's not on my dime. Somebody, some private company, is not only paying for the right to do that, they're making a whole bunch of money warehousing these young black boys and young African American and Latino men that you're going to be talking about in this committee tomorrow. So you can't tell me that I'm going to be paying for that long term if we continue in this direction, number one. But number two, how do you in a state like California or any place else, but certainly in California, balance the economic concern, if you want to make that argument, the economic burden that I should be concerned about with the fact that we got a budget deficit, and clearly these kinds of concerns aren't at the top of anybody's agenda in Sacramento, save you, maybe, and a couple other people.
Well, I would say, first, I think there's certainly a moral reason why we need to be concerned and try to find a solution here. Also, we prefer someone, once someone makes a mistake and they find themselves in custody, we do have a responsibility to rehabilitate, to make an attempt to rehabilitate, so when that person is released back into the community, they become a productive citizen, not someone who has few alternatives and find themselves reoffending. Then there's a victim involved with that, and then returning to prison. So I think that it's shameful that in our state that the prison budget is outpacing our budget for higher education.
Precisely.
It is unacceptable. And I just think that we can assume that there's nothing that can be done about it. But what Dr. Fellitti's report shows is that you can track these incidents and these occurrences and their adverse impact. And so what we're saying is that, is there a way for us as a society to interrupt these adverse cycles? I believe there is. I believe that if a child has conflict resolution issues in kindergarten, that we ought to pay attention to that. That those things mean something when they appear. As we're learning tragically in the shootings on campuses when we ignore signs. And I think that it's not purely economic, and it's not. So I think that would be way too crass. But I think that we, as a society, have a responsibility. Me as a policy maker, I have a responsibility for good public policy. And for that policy to be representative of the people that I'm supposed to represent, then what does it do? And I think there's a lot of ways we can address this question where we have some good public policy that can solve some of these problems.
I want to talk in a moment about what good public policy looks like on these issues, but let me stay with your point about the moral rationale for why we need to address these issues, and say to you respectfully, before I ask Dr. Felitti your follow-up here, that Dr. King made the moral argument, many years ago. There have been other great Americans who've made the moral argument, and let's be frank about it, the moral argument in this country doesn't always win the day. I mean, every now and again, you can get some traction on that, but the moral argument often doesn't come in first place in the race. What matters to Americans, it seems, more than the moral argument is the economic question. So, Dr. Felitti, let me ask you, since you threw this out here, you suggested there is an enormous cost that the public is bearing and will continue to bear in the months and years to come if we don't start to address this more seriously. Give me some sense of what we're talking about here.
Well, we have thought a lot about this, and it seems to us that the low-hanging fruit would lie in the realm of that enormous section of the population, section of us, who have had no direct personal experience with supportive parenting. Many of whom might do better if we only knew what it looked like. So how would you help tens of millions of people in the country have a better understanding of what supportive parenting looks like? There's only one vehicle for doing that, and that's broadcast television. To give it as lessons would hardly be acceptable. To weave it into the storyline of some serial story or drama would be highly acceptable. The material, as you've seen, is sufficiently lurid that in the hands of any capable writer, it's certainly going to be of interest to enormous numbers of people, and hence paid for by enormous numbers of advertisers. So one of our thoughts is, what if one were to work into the storyline of some serial drama, illustrations of what supportive parenting looked like and how it played out over a lifespan, contrasting that with illustrations of what destructive parenting looked like and how did that play out over a lifetime. That, I think, would be the easiest starting point that I can conceive of in the realm of trying to prevent these problems in the first place, rather than attempting to fix them after they occur, which is monstrously complex and expensive.
We all heard you suggest earlier, not suggest, but in fact say earlier, that of this 17,000 plus sample you've been working with, I think you said 80% white, 10% Hispanic, 10% African American.
10% black, 10% Asian.
10% Asian, that's what you said, okay. So that 80% white number struck me because I want you to disabuse me of this notion, if you can. Disabuse me of the notion that the reason why we have not gotten traction on this kind of crisis heretofore is because the issue has been color-coded. And I raise that because poverty is so much connected to what's wrong with our country right about now. And I argue that one of the reasons why poverty is finally starting to get some traction is not just because Occupy showed up last year, but because the new poor in this country are the former middle class. Now that white folk are experiencing what Negroes and Latinos and others have been experiencing for so many, many years, the issue is starting to resonate with all of us because we all find ourselves now struggling trying to make it through this economy, whereas heretofore, poverty has been color-coded. On this very issue, tell me why, if you can, I should not believe that we have not gotten the kind of national conversation going on this kind of crisis, because this issue as well has been color-coded, never mind your 80% white sample.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is certainly correct. I don't have any doubt about that, but it's not the only issue. I believe underlying that and applicable to all sectors of the population is the fact that this stuff works in realms that we've all been taught growing up nice people don't talk about. You know, you don't hang the family's dirty laundry out on the line for everybody to see. You don't talk about the fact that dad's an alcoholic. You don't talk about the fact that your brother's in prison, etc. These, I think, are wider than racial divisions, which surely exist. I believe that that's the main stumbling block that we face. And not having ever been allowed to talk about these things growing up, we have no experience as adults talking about them. They're uncomfortable subjects. They're more easily avoided. Most physicians would prefer to respond to the symptom of the week rather than to the comprehensive issues underlying that. It's simply easier, and sometimes it works well, and sometimes it doesn't, and you pay a hell of a big bill for ongoing chronic care.
Before I go back to Mr. Swanson, these, Dr. Felitti, if these are the challenges that an exclusively middle class, largely white sample has been dealing with and are now experiencing these travails later in life because of the childhood trauma, what does that say to you about the impact of these very issues on the larger society?
Oh, I think it's perfectly obvious. If things are this bad in a large middle-class population, they surely don't get better if you're living on the street, if you're in prison, if you're a member of a minority group. For sure, they're going to be worse. I don't think there's any reason to doubt that whatsoever.
Mr. Swanson, to the point you raised earlier now, what does good public policy look like? I mean, you are conducting these hearings across the state, specifically on the crisis of men and boys of color. But obviously, as a legislator, you know where you want to take this. You're just trying to do the research you need to do to get the traction that you need in Sacramento to get this good public policy through. So in broad strokes, what does good public policy look like vis-a-vis this issue?
Well, first of all, what we try to do is explain that even though the state has been in a financial crisis, that there is enough money to address these questions.
You believe that?
I believe there's enough money to address these questions because we can start with fixing the dysfunctional prison system. There's a couple of $1 billion right there. We have a 70%. Oh, okay.
I'll point that. Yeah.
We have a 70% recidivism rate. Many states don't have a 70% recidivism rate. That means that we're doing something terribly wrong. Why states, large states, have a 25% recidivism rate? And so I believe that we can fix this. Why is it that when we have a computer class in prison, that those individuals that are lucky enough to take that computer class and learn some basic skills recidivate at a rate of 5%. So every time they don't come back, that saves us money that should be redirected. Why is it that troubled youth, in studies it's been shown that if you go out into any school district here in Los Angeles or anywhere else in the state, and you put 40 troubled youth in a room, and you put in that room an instructor for every 10, so that if you have a question, you don't have to shout it out in class. You can just tell me, and not be embarrassed about it, and I can respond to it. Well, the graduation and attendance rate in that group that have that kind of attention is an 80 percentile because someone cares. I visited San Quentin and talked to some young men in San Quentin, just talking with them. The fact that I was there meant a lot to them. And if, in fact, we had policy that says, okay, I'll tell you what, you serve your time and you're going to be released, and if you get a GED, your parole time will even be shortened. Mm-hmm. Other states have done it. That's good public policy. It's saved us money. It's given them some incentive. I've had a bill that I put on the governor's desk, actually Governor Schwarzenegger's desk, a couple of times, and was vetoed. And that was allowing California for us to give food stamps to ex-drug felons that are released. Basic food stamps, federal dollars for the food stamp program. And they would then be released. That would be added to other kind of services and other wraparound services to help them get a start. Why not? When we look at why we do things, why is it too costly to have more nurses in our campuses? Why, when we have clinics in our school campuses, it makes a big difference. When the endowment does in the number of communities that they're doing their healthy communities activity, it's the holistic approach. The returns will show that it's not about money, but it is about the effort and us as a community deciding that we're going to do something about this, and then we're all going to be held accountable for the results.
Dr. Felitti, I just asked a politician, an elected official, what the political response to this ought to be, what public policy ought to look like. Let me ask a physician a two-part question, which they tell you to never do in media, but let me do it because I think you might want to connect these two things. I want to get to some of these audience questions in just a few minutes here. So we know what the legislature can and perhaps ought to be doing. Is there a role, given this data, for physicians to play, number one? And number two, how does this current debate about health care, does it in any way open up an avenue, any avenues, for us to gain some traction on these issues?
Thus far, I don't think the debate on health care, as I have heard and understood it, addresses the crux issues at all. It simply focuses on how to pay for an extraordinarily expensive product that has some major defects in it. The role that physicians can play is both simple and difficult. It's important to understand that there are only 3 sources of diagnostic information in all of medicine: history, physical examination, laboratory studies. If you talk with patients, and I have done this literally with 10,000 people by questionnaire, patients overwhelmingly at the 99% level assume the diagnosis comes out of lab tests. You know, give me an MRI, doc, and tell me what's wrong. If you talk with experienced physicians, they'll tell you that about 80% of the time, diagnosis comes out of the medical history. What you were watching up here with those patients was medical history. There's no lab test for an incest history, etc. So that's crux information. It's time-consuming, hence expensive, fraught with all sorts of interpersonal difficulties. Well, you know, this guy's kind of young. I don't know if I want to talk to him about this, etc. What we have seen is that a well-devised medical questionnaire filled out at home, important, not in the waiting room, filled out at home is of inordinate value in gaining this information so that you know ahead of time before meeting someone where you need to go, where you don't need to go, in further working that out. Anything that could be done to stimulate the use of comprehensive medical history routinely would be a huge step forward. Putting that, for instance, on the internet would be a very big step forward, that people could fill this out at home, and if they wished, print it out, and if they wished, give it to their physicians.
To what extent, if any, are these problems, these challenges exacerbated by a lack of access to health care, and particularly, let me throw in mental health?
Oh, you're certainly asking simple questions.
That's my job, to ask the simple questions.
Yeah, well, certainly they're exacerbated by lack of access to health care. But on the other hand, unless health care takes a more comprehensive approach to understand what's going on, it's not necessarily going to move things forward significantly in the right direction. It's terrific if you've broken your leg. Okay, it doesn't have much to do with other ongoing problems: chronic back pain, chronic headaches, obesity, alcoholism, etc. Mental health, unfortunately, has commonly settled on the use of medications, which are invaluable, but not the sole approach. So I don't have a concise answer to your question. It's a very difficult one.
Mr. Zimmerman, I wonder if the data that you've heard tonight, combined with the data that you have already gathered in your select committee hearings, and just the wisdom that you bring to this position after 30 years of being in the public service arena, I wonder if this, you know, all of this combined says anything to you about the so-called war on drugs in this country, how we're fighting it, how it ought to change, what we're doing wrong. Dr. Felitti, I promise I'll give you some of this in just a second. I can see you want to respond. Now I finally asked the question you want to answer. All right. So I promise I'll let you answer that. But I wonder if I'm actually glad that you're both here, because I mean, and one physician and of course one elected official, because there are different answers to these questions, and these answers may be nuanced depending on, you know, given that you both have two different professions that you're pursuing. But let me start with you first, Mr. Swanson. Does any of this say, and I don't want to color that anymore because there's so many ways to go, legalization, and you know, there's so many different answers, but does it say anything to you at all about how we are applying this so-called war on drugs in America?
Well, I think that problems with drugs, it's clearly a medical problem, a dependency problem, and it should be handled that way. I don't think you're going to solve drug problem in America with just force. That's not going to do it. I think you have to address the people, and I think that's important. Now, I have not been a fan of the legalization of marijuana in California for the reason that I think that the national government has to address that question. And what you will find out is that if California tries to do something separately from the national agenda on that question, then there's disproportionate prosecution of those cases. And now the federal government is looking at prosecuting these cases. But I think we have to go in the direction, in addition to that, as a practical matter, the more you talk about, and you talk about young men of color, the more you talk about the legalization of marijuana, let's say marijuana, the more you think that that's a recreational drug. A lot of our young men are not getting jobs today because they can't pass the drug test. And there are consequences for these activities that have a practical impact in communities of color that we have to think about. And so I would offer that comment, but I believe that it's a health issue that we have to address, and at that point I'll turn it over to the doctor.
Before I do that, our good friends here at Callendar are going to start collecting these cards. So for those who do have questions, comments on those cards, they're going to come through the aisles right about now, start collecting those. So for the last 15 or 18 minutes of this conversation, I can ask your questions of our guest tonight. Dr. Felitti, though, again, you've done the research here, and I asked that question in part because drug and alcohol was such an important part of your research, and I was struck, not just struck isn't a strong enough word, I almost fell out this chair, as I'm sure others in the audience did, when you made that point about crystal meth. Who knew? I mean, who knew that this was offered as, I was completely blown away by that. But what has your research said to you that you now want to say to us about drugs in America?
Let me give you the first level of answer by way of an analogy. When a house is burning down, typically what you see is the smoke billowing out, not flames 50 feet in the high. You see the smoke. And if you didn't really know much about the relationship of smoke to fire, you might think, well, my God, that's obviously the essence of the problem. And besides, I've heard people can die of smoke inhalation. So if that's the essence of the problem, we better bring big fans to blow the smoke away. Yeah, it's not ha-ha. The house burns down faster, and pretty soon people start not calling for help anymore. There's a real analogy there to what we're doing with street drugs, with alcohol and so forth, with tobacco as well. It's the same idea. Being a druggie for that individual is not the problem. Maybe a big nuisance for people around them, no question about that. For the individual involved, it is not the problem. It's the manifestation of the best attempt that they've come across so far to deal with problems that are unrecognized and that no one wants to talk about. I never met anybody who smoked 3 packs a day to get lung cancer or heart disease or bladder cancer. People smoke because of the psychoactive benefits of nicotine, which are profound. Nicotine is well understood to have potent anti-anxiety activity, potent antidepressant activity, appetite suppressant activity, and anger suppressant activity. I mean, my God, the American Indians were not burning moss or oak leaves in a peace pipe. Tobacco was selected for ceremonial use because of good experience with it. Isn't it dangerous? Yes. In 20 or 30 years, it's very dangerous. In 20 or 30 seconds with inhalation, it's very helpful. And I think most of us understand that when the screws are on tight enough, we're likely to sell out the future to get relief now. That's the essence of what needs to be kept in mind with the drug problem. What is being treated by that individual? Louise Robbins, a name you might wish to Google and look up, did a very important study in the closing years of the Vietnam War. She had almost 900 American soldiers who acknowledged to her, not to the Army or the Medical Corps, but to her, that they had used heroin daily for the antecedent 30 days. I mean, by anybody's definition, somebody using heroin every day for 30 days is an addict. Upon returning to the United States with no treatment, important, no treatment, 8 months later, 95% of them were no longer using heroin. That's kind of an interesting story. Louise Robbins, R-O-B-B-I-N-S. Google it. I mean, the conventional view is you take heroin enough times, you're not going to be able to stop. Well, maybe if you really need it, you're not going to be able to stop. If it's the best thing you've come across, if inhaled nicotine is the best thing you've come across, I mean, I need relief now, not in 20 years. So I think that would be the best of my initial answer to your question.
Let me now move, as I promised, to some of these audience questions, and there's some good ones in here. So if you thought mine was simple, wait till you read some of these. The first question is for you, Dr. Felitti. How well are these ACE interviews being integrated into physician practice, medical school curricula, therapist, counselor training?
Piece of cake.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Thank you very much. Next question. No.
The resistance to using it is enormous.
Why so?
I suspect that there are at least several reasons, one of which undoubtedly is personal ghosts. Presenting this to large medical audiences, 200, 300, 400 physicians. By about 8 minutes, the level of anguish on people's faces exceeds anything that I would be willing to attribute to empathic responses. I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that personal ghosts are being awakened. Furthermore, something unique has happened a number of times. I've had 1 or 2 people explosively leave the auditorium with fits of uncontrollable bronchospastic coughing. I have never seen that happen to another speaker. I've never had it happen to me with a different subject. So in some way or other, this is deeply disturbing to many, many of us. Another explanation. A very bright colleague of mine says to me one day, but what would I do if I asked? And somebody said yes. I'm no damn shrink. I'm a cardiologist, etc. Well, the answer is, tell me how that's affected you later in your life. It works. I mean, what patients have to say is concise. It doesn't open Pandora's box. The answers are remarkably to the point and often help you understand where you need to go next, etc. People are willing to talk about this because it's an enormous relief to find that somebody finally seems interested and understands this and is willing to listen.
Let me ask you another question before I go to this, Mr. Swanson here. Dr. Felitti, what is known, if anything, about the childhood background of parents of these abused clients?
Relatively little, because we only had the patients themselves to talk with. And parents in general are not open about sharing their childhoods.
It's an unfair question. Do you have any reason to believe or sense, as I heard a couple of echoes in the audience, that this might be part of a cycle?
I'm not sure what you mean by a cycle.
It happened to them, and it happened to the parents.
Yes, I believe that's certainly true. When you have parents who are not capable, for whatever reason, of supportive parenting, that's going to produce heavily damaged children. This is, by the way, largely avoided by the press. You think of the Columbine shooters and any of the school shooting situations and so forth. I'm always impressed how there's nothing in there in the newspaper articles about who raised these kids. You know, were they born and then nobody touched them afterwards?
Mr. Swanson.
You'll notice in two of the video clips mention of parental loss through divorce, a hugely important issue that is totally untouched. I suspect because so many of us have been divorced that we really, don't want to embarrass ourselves by going nearing it. If you talk with adults who have become obese in childhood, the coincidence of childhood obesity onset approximating the age of parental loss, typically through divorce, is remarkable.
That is the most depressing thing you've said all night. Because if that's what our problem is in America, then we are really in trouble given these divorce rates that don't seem to be abating.
Yes. It's a very serious issue.
Yeah. A question for you, Assembly Member. What impact, in your opinion, do you think the California prison realignment will have on the issues that we're discussing tonight?
Well, if the dollars follow the inmates, then, which is probably not going to happen. If the dollars follow then some of the local communities actually could do a better job. But you have to have the dollars to follow through realignment. And so solutions can be reached through realignment, but it's going to take resources to do that and to help with successful rehabilitation. And I believe that there are ways to do that, and it serves all of us because there are some individuals that are a lot more difficult than others to rehabilitate, higher risk to the community than others. But if our system is so overburdened because we're sort of paroling everyone more than could possibly be supervised, and we're not paying attention to the question of risk to the community or rehabilitation, then it will stay broken. So there's a possibility that this can work, but the jury's still out. The dollars are going to have to follow the inmates for the communities to be able to handle it successfully.
While you're on the microphone, another question. If you're studying men and boys of color, how do you factor in the female influences that may trigger poor behaviors? Put another way, how can your hearing, will it address breaking the cycle? I assume the question is intended to get to mothers who may be passing on these behaviors to boys, or the flip side of that, which I find just as often, is that mothers who are, shall we say, too soft on their boys because they're single moms and because of this, and this.
Well, there's no question that this has to be a holistic approach to this problem. We're emphasizing men and boys of color to sort of highlight the fact that they have the highest dropout rate. They tend to have the highest homicide rate among their age groups on each other. They tend to have the highest incarceration rate, and so we're emphasizing that. But obviously, parenting has something to do with what has to happen here, and it's part of the solution, because part of this is not just highlighting that these realities exist, but us also figuring out what do we do to solve it. And that's why we're undertaking this mission. We want to learn what is working, because in some communities with very little resources, some and a lot of faith-based organizations are leading the charge with very little resources, paying attention and solving these problems. We have to take those best practices and make sure that they're part of good public policy.
Dr. Felitti, if someone has a problem with addiction, is the solution really to identify their childhood experiences or treat the addiction?
I don't think the addiction can be successfully treated, by and large, without paying attention to what the underlying causes of it were. Otherwise, you're essentially taking somebody's attempted solution away without any understanding of what's really going on. It's not advice likely to be followed.
Yeah, may I just say that we made a huge error when we got rid of mental health clinics and paying attention to the question of mental health.
Yeah.
And we're locking people up that really need treatment, and we're not solving that problem. And so I just think that there is That's part of a public policy decision that was made that has had dire impacts on our community.
Yeah. Dr. Felitti, can you explain, this is a big question in the time we have left here, but I'm curious to hear this answer as well. Can you explain the neurobiological impact of childhood trauma as it relates to adult illness? In other words, what is the actual causal link to illness?
There are at least 2, perhaps 3 broad categories, how one moves from life experience to structural disease, to biomedical disease. The easy one is through various coping devices. Overeating to feel better, becoming diabetic as a result. Smoking to feel better, developing chronic lung disease, malignancy, etc., heart disease as a result. Drinking to kind of tune things down, have a drink, sit down, relax. The consequences of that. Those are fairly easy to understand. In the very same vein, buying crystal meth on the street, etc. Marijuana, same idea, marijuana basically an anti-anxiety agent. That's easy to understand. The second category is only coming into understanding in recent years. The huge effect of chronic, unrelieved stress on the way the brain works. What is commonly referred to as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, dysregulation of which ultimately occurs, leading to dysregulation of one's immune system. Okay, so what does that really mean? All of us every day have a couple of bacteria pass into our bloodstream. You brush your teeth hard, you have a hard bowel movement, whatever. There will be some bacteria pass into your blood. We don't die of overwhelming bloodstream infection. Our immune systems process that out. Similarly, all of us every day form a few malignant cells, a few cancer cells. We don't die of cancer from them. They're processed out. On the other hand, if our immune system is suppressed, and a common example that many of you may have heard of is if you have an organ transplant and have to be on immunosuppression the rest of your life, you will have an increased likelihood of malignancy somewhere in your body. That's been known for 20 years or more. So suppression of the immune system, regardless of the mechanism, could be prednisone out of a bottle, could be dysregulation of your own immune system, etc., internally as a result of chronic uncontrolled stress, will cause decreased ability to recognize and destroy malignant cells, regardless of their cause. So getting cancer means one of 2 things. Either you are producing malignant cells at an increased rate, 3 packs a day will get you there, radiation will get you there, etc., or your ability to recognize them and process them out has been impaired. So those are 2 broad pathways. The third is really new. It involves what is referred to as epigenetics, the alteration of genetic function, not changing the gene, but essentially turning a gene off as a result of life experiences. This is very new. If you want to read more about it, the way to look it up would be under the word epigenetics, E-P-I-G-E-N-E-T-I-C-S. Those would be the three major pathways by which life experience translates into structural disease.
I want to, if I can, take moderator's privilege and end our conversation tonight on a note of hope. And I want to ask both of our guests what sustains their hope, or put another way, what makes them hopeful, particularly Dr. Felitti, given all that he has seen over these years doing the research, and for that matter, Mr. Swanson, what sustains your hope, what makes you hopeful? I ask that against the backdrop of recognizing that optimism and hope are 2 very different things. Optimism suggests there's a particular set of facts or circumstances or conditions, something you can see, feel, or touch that gives you reason to believe that things are going to get better, and that's not necessarily what we heard tonight. So I'm not asking a question about optimism. Hope, rather, is a very different thing, and I do believe, and I'm an example, and I know there are others in this room, I'm an example that you can build a whole life on hope. So the question is not so much about optimism, given what we've discussed tonight, but about how it is that we sustain our hope, why it is that we remain hopeful, that we can make some progress on these issues, given all that we've discussed tonight. So let's leave on a note of hope, if we can. I'll start with you, Mr. Swanson, and with your response.
Well, first of all, let me just take a moment of personal privilege to acknowledge my chairman that he walked in the room. The chairman of the California Legislative Black Caucus and one of our state's fine senators, Kern Price. Could you please acknowledge him? That's how I get some votes in the Senate side, you know. Well, let me just say, first of all, I don't want this evening, our hearings tomorrow, to eliminate my concern or my request of all of you to acknowledge that personal responsibility still plays a role in all this. All of us have to be personally responsible. I mean, you noticed when I walked up on stage, I had a cane. When I walked up on stage, so I tell you, if you're over 50 and you're taking a shower, and you get out of the shower, and the phone rings, your body might tell you can run over there and answer that phone. Well, if you try to do it like I try to do it, you do the James Brown right there in the bathroom, you know, you'll learn that you're responsible for some decisions that you make. And so that's important. Now, and then finally, hopefully, I would say, with reference to hope, this point about what we've been trying to do. Someone showed me this the other day, and so it belongs to someone else other than me. But they took the $2 and they crumbled this one up, and they said, if this is trauma, my good doctor, if this is a broken life, what's the difference? The only difference, they have the same value. And my hope is that we'll see that these young men of color as having the same value as your child, as your cousin, as and we work to straighten it out, what the endowment's trying to do. It can be straightened out. So I'm hopeful that we will get that message. And I apologize to whoever I stole this from.
I have a very simple rule about that. The first time you use somebody else's stuff, give them attribution. I heard so-and-so say. The second time you use it, say, I heard somebody say. And the third time you use it, as I always say. After two or three times, you ain't got to give attribution no more.
Great.
It's yours. Somebody once said that the good ones borrow, the great ones steal.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Well, Tavis told me, so
there
that's
you go.
We'll go.
Dr. Felitti, last word, sir.
Well, I think if one takes a long enough view, which is painfully long, the world is clearly becoming a better place. You compare things now with the way they were in the 15th century. I don't think any of us. Is there going to be improvement without tremendous anguish and loss of life? No. I think that's the sad truth. Might we, with big effort and ingenuity, make things happen a little better, a little bit faster? Yeah, it's certainly possible. It's frustrating work. In the long view, I think all of us would agree that things slowly move in a better direction.
We wouldn't have had this conversation tonight were it not for a lot of years of research, dedication, and hard work, courage, conviction, commitment, and character to bring this data to life. So please, first, thank Dr. Felitti for his work and for being here tonight. it is the backstory of that research that gets us to a place that we can really start to wrestle with the reality that the data presents us, and so we move into the future better prepared. And I pray, and I know you do, that these select hearings here in California can lead to some positive results for all of us, but certainly for men of color, boys of color who are enduring these crises now, and more importantly, for those men of color, boys of color yet unborn. So please thank Senator Swanson for the work he's doing and will do into the future. And last but not least, come on, Dr. Ross, have the last word. Last but not least, let me ask you to recognize and to thank again for their work on this issue and in this gorgeous facility. So much good work is being done here to empower us, to enlighten us, to inspire us here in California. And for that, we thank the California Endowment and its leader, Dr. Ross. Please thank them for having us.
Let me, the host privilege, thank you, Senator Price, for joining us. Senator Swanson, I'll see you tomorrow at the hearing. A big thank you to the best manager of conversation on this planet, and that is Tavis Smiley.
You're kind.
If you have a mailing list of anything related to this.
Let me share with you, and you may hear this at the risk of stealing someone's thunder tomorrow. I think you'll hear from a group of young people tomorrow, Senator Swanson, an example of where leadership emanating from our young people is moving forward to address these issues. There's a group, I'm not sure they may be here this evening, the Youth Justice Coalition. Where are you at? They're here. They're in the house. They operate out of, shall we say, Spartan facility in South Central Los Angeles, on the border of South Central Los Angeles and Inglewood. And they operate a program that takes in any young person off the street who is in crisis. No matter what that issue is, no matter what they're dealing with, if they've been abused, if they've been in a gang, if they've been on drugs, if they've had a child out of wedlock and school kicks them out, the Youth Justice Coalition will take them in. And on top of that, as a bonus, they train young people to be advocate warriors for positive social change. And so we had an event here where young people had gathered through technology in Oakland, in Sacramento, in Fresno, and here around the crisis of our young men being pushed out of school through excessive suspensions and expulsions. And I discovered this organization because one of the young students, one of the young people from that particular coalition, spoke at the rally and spoke so eloquently and so powerfully. I had to pull her aside afterward and said, "Who are you?" And she told me her name, and she was with the Youth Justice Coalition, and they said, "You should need to come out and visit Dr. Ross," and I did. And they have an idea. Assembly member and senator, their idea is to take 1 penny out of every dollar in the criminal justice and incarceration and public safety budget in the region of Los Angeles, 1 cent on each dollar, 1%, and put it into youth development and job creation for young people. And through the research they've done, they've calculated that $100 million could be generated. Okay. Now, that's not coming from Harvard or Rand or even USC or even this building. That's coming from those young people in South Central Los Angeles. And the day I visited them, in fact, there was an altar in the classroom because one of their young classmates was killed in a drive-by shooting the day before. And so, hope and optimism, if those young people can believe in the circumstances that they come from, that there is a future and there are solutions, that we need to believe too. Thank you very much. Have a good night.